Deep in the heart of Atlanta's leafy suburbs stands a monument to everything the Gilded Age represented: wealth without wisdom, and dreams that devoured their dreamers. A 42 acres mansion owned by one of the America's wealthy icon. Over 40 rooms in the main mansion, 40 bedrooms, and 10 bathrooms. At a time when most Atlanta homes had one bathroom, this alone marked extreme luxury. Marble fireplaces in every bedroom. Each bedroom had its own carved marble fireplace, an unheard of indulgence in the 1920s. This feature wasn't about comfort, it was about status and excess. The question is, how could one man's endless spending turn a palace into a trap? This is the tragic story of Briarcliffe, a noble mansion that witnessed the rise and spectacular fall of one of America's most troubled old money dynasties. January morning in 1931, a groundskeeper made a discovery that would stain this gilded manor's legacy forever. 2 bodies, a smoking revolver, and secrets that a family's fortune couldn't bury. But to understand how death found its way to this 42-acre wonderland, we must travel back to dusty Georgia crossroads, where carbonated dreams first bubbled into an empire. The fog that morning was particularly thick, the kind that transforms familiar landscapes into something alien and menacing. James Stark had walked these grounds countless times, knew every curve of the putting green, every shadow cast by the towering oaks. But that morning, something felt different. The silence was too complete, as if the estate itself was holding its breath. Then what James Stark discovered in that car would echo through Atlanta society for decades, would transform this magnificent estate from a symbol of possibility into a monument of tragedy, and would add another dark chapter to a story already filled with excess, scandal, and the particular kind of ruin that only limitless wealth can purchase. The humble beginnings of an empire. But our story doesn't begin with death. It begins with a brown, fizzy liquid, and a man who saw in it something that others could not. The South, in the years following the Civil War, was a place of reconstruction in every sense: physical, economic, and spiritual. The old plantation economy had collapsed, and in its place, a new class of entrepreneurs was emerging. These men weren't born to wealth. They built it from nothing, armed with little more than determination and an almost religious faith in the power of commerce. Asa Candler Sr. was born in 1851 in Villarica, Georgia, a small town whose name promised riches it couldn't deliver. His father, Samuel Charles Candler, was a merchant and planter who had managed to maintain some prosperity even through the war's devastation. The family was Methodist, deeply so, and young Asa grew up in a household where hard work wasn't just encouraged, it was considered a moral imperative, second only to faith itself. As a boy, Asa watched his father work from dawn until dusk, managing the store, tending the land, always moving, always building. The lesson wasn't lost on him. Success, he learned, came to those who refused to rest, who saw opportunity where others saw only obstacles. He dreamed of becoming a physician, of healing the sick and easing suffering. But the path to medical school was expensive, and so he settled on the next best thing: pharmacy. In 1873, at the age of 22, he moved to Atlanta with $1.75 in his pocket and a determination that would have seemed comical if it hadn't been so absolute. Atlanta in 1873 was a city still bearing the scars of General Sherman's march. Entire neighborhoods remained in ruins, and the population was a fraction of what it had been before the war. But Asa Candler saw past the devastation. He saw a city ready to be reborn, a place where a young man with ambition could make his mark. He took a job at a pharmacy, learning the trade from men who had survived the war and were now trying to survive the peace. He mixed compounds, filled prescriptions, and sold patent medicines. those miraculous elixirs that promise to cure everything from dropsy to melancholia. Most of them were worthless, of course, little more than alcohol and sugar with a hint of something exotic to justify the price. But Asa learned that in medicine, as in life, perception mattered as much as reality. By 1877, he had saved enough to open his own pharmacy. He married Lucy Elizabeth Howard, and together they began building not just a business, but a dynasty. Over the next decade, Asa Candler became known throughout Atlanta as a reliable pharmacist, a Methodist who could be trusted not to water down his compounds or substitute cheaper ingredients. But reliability doesn't build empires. For that, you need something more: vision, luck, or both. In 1888, a man named John Stith Pemberton came to Asa Candler with a proposition. Pemberton was a pharmacist like Candler, but he was also a Confederate veteran who had been wounded in battle and had subsequently developed an addiction to morphine. In his attempts to find a cure for his addiction, he had created various elixirs and tonics, experimenting with coca leaves and cola nuts, with sugar and carbonated water. One of these experiments had resulted in a peculiar beverage he called Coca-Cola. He marketed it as a cure for headaches, nervousness, and even morphine addiction, the very affliction from which he himself suffered. The drink had achieved modest local success, sold primarily at pharmacy soda fountains throughout Atlanta. But Pemberton was dying, his health destroyed by years of morphine use and the lingering effects of his war wounds. He needed money, and he needed it quickly. The exact details of the transaction have been lost to history, obscured by conflicting accounts and the passage of time. Some say Candler paid $2,300 for the formula. Others claim the price was lower, that Candler acquired it piece by piece from Pemberton and his various business partners. What's certain is that by 1891, Asa Candler owned the Coca-Cola formula outright, and he saw in it something that Pemberton never had: not just a medicine, but a brand. Candler wasn't interested in curing headaches. He was interested in creating desire. He threw himself into marketing with an intensity that bordered on mania. He gave away thousands of free drink vouchers, ensuring that people throughout Atlanta could try Coca-Cola without risk. He plastered the name on everything: calendars, clocks, serving trays, thermometers. Anywhere people might look, they would see those distinctive flowing letters: Coca-Cola. He hired salesmen and sent them across the South with a simple message. Coca-Cola was refreshing, delicious, and distinctly American. He demanded that the drink be served ice cold, in a distinctive curved glass that would become iconic. He controlled every aspect of the experience, understanding that people weren't just buying a beverage, they were buying a feeling, a moment of pleasure in an often harsh world. The strategy worked beyond his wildest imaginings. By 1895, just 7 years after acquiring the formula, Coca-Cola was being sold in every state and territory in the United States. Asa Candler had become a millionaire many times over, and the brown syrup that had been a dying man's last desperate attempt at financial security had become the foundation of a fortune that would span generations. But with wealth came complications. Asa Candler now had money, more money than he had ever dreamed possible. He had a beautiful wife and 5 children. He had a business that seemed to print money with every bottle sold. What he didn't have was control over what that money would do to his family, how it would warp and twist the natural development of his children, especially the one everyone called Buddy, the problem child. Asa Griggs Candler Jr. was born in 1880 at a time when his father's pharmacy business was successful but not yet prosperous. He was the second of 5 children, and from the very beginning he was different from his siblings in ways that troubled his parents deeply. His older brother, Charles Howard, was everything Asa Sr. could have hoped for in an heir: studious, responsible, eager to please. Charles followed instructions, excelled in his studies, and showed every sign of inheriting his father's business acumen. The younger children, too, seemed to fit into the family's Methodist mold: respectful, hard-working, pious. But Buddy was none of those things. He couldn't sit still during church services, fidgeting and squirming until his mother had to take him outside. He struggled in school, not because he wasn't intelligent. His teachers acknowledged his quick mind, but because he couldn't focus on lessons that didn't interest him. He would start projects with tremendous enthusiasm only to abandon them days later when something new caught his attention. He argued with his parents, questioned their rules, and seemed constitutionally incapable of accepting authority. Today, we might recognize Buddy's symptoms as attention deficit disorder, a neurological condition that affects the brain's executive function and impulse control. But in 1880s, Georgia, such diagnoses didn't exist. There were only good children and difficult children, and Buddy was decidedly the latter. Asa and Lucy Candler tried everything. They disciplined him, but punishment seemed to have no lasting effect. They reasoned with him, but he would agree to behave better and then immediately forget his promise. They prayed over him, asking God to straighten out this wayward son, but the heavens remained silent. Finally, in 1888, the same year Asa purchased the Coca-Cola formula, they made a desperate decision. They would send 8-year-old Buddy away to live with his Aunt Florence in Cartersville, Georgia, about 50 miles from Atlanta. Aunt Florence ran a school which seemed promising. The fact that it was an all-girls school should have given them pause, but they were desperate. Perhaps a different environment, away from the distractions of home, would help Buddy find focus. It didn't work. Aunt Florence and her husband did their best, but Buddy remained Buddy. He was charming when he wanted to be, capable of incredible bursts of energy and enthusiasm, but he couldn't maintain that focus, couldn't channel his considerable talents in any productive direction. He wasn't cruel or malicious, quite the opposite. Everyone who met Buddy liked him immediately. He had a natural charisma, a way of making people feel special and understood. But likability doesn't equal discipline, and discipline was what Buddy lacked entirely. After several years in Cartersville, Buddy returned home, somewhat improved, but fundamentally unchanged. He enrolled at Emory College, following in his brother Charles's footsteps. One of his classmates was a young man named Alvin Barkley, who would go on to become Vice President of the United States under Harry Truman. Barkley distinguished himself academically and politically even in college, showing the kind of steady, measured progress that leads to greatness. Buddy showed no such progress. He attended classes sporadically, performed well in subjects that interested him and poorly in those that didn't. What truly captured his imagination were the automobiles that were just beginning to appear on American roads. These mechanical marvels represented everything Buddy loved: speed, freedom, novelty, the promise of going anywhere at any moment. While other students debated philosophy and theology, Buddy read about horsepower and combustion engines. After college, Asa Sr. made another attempt to direct his son's energies productively. He sent Buddy out west to help establish Coca-Cola bottling plants, hoping that responsibility and distance might mature him. The strategy had mixed results. Buddy did work hard when something captured his imagination, and the logistics of setting up bottling operations certainly qualified as interesting. He threw himself into the work with characteristic intensity, traveling from city to city, meeting with potential partners, solving problems that arose. But he also spent money recklessly, made impulsive decisions that his father had to reverse, and generally operated as if tomorrow would never come with bills to pay, love, loss, and the seeds of destruction. In 1905, Buddy did something that shocked his family. He made a responsible decision. He married Helen McGill, the daughter of Ralph McGill, a respected Georgia newspaper editor. Helen was everything Atlanta society admired: cultured, graceful, well-educated, and active in all the right social organizations. She belonged to the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the Atlanta Women's Club, and the Fine Arts Club. The local newspapers frequently praised her elegant gowns and impeccable taste. For a time, it seemed like Helen might be exactly what Buddy needed: a stabilizing influence, someone who could channel his energies in productive directions. They had a son, and Buddy seemed to settle down, taking more interest in the family business, spending more time at home. And then the baby died. Infant mortality was tragically common in the early 20th century, but that statistical reality provided no comfort to parents who had just lost a child. For Helen, the loss was devastating, but somehow bearable, cushioned by her faith and her social network. For Buddy, something broke. He had never been entirely stable, had always operated on the edge of control. Now, with grief tearing through him, he lost whatever tenuous grip he had maintained on his impulses. He threw himself into work with manic energy, launching project after ambitious project as if he could outrun sorrow through sheer velocity. He became obsessed with automobile racing, convinced that speed could provide the release he so desperately needed. He began drinking more heavily, not yet to the point of alcoholism, but enough that people noticed, enough that his wife worried. He talked rapidly, jumped from subject to subject, made grandiose plans that he would later abandon. In 1909, he unveiled what seemed at the time like his most audacious scheme yet: the Atlanta Speedway. The Speedway, a monument to velocity. The Atlanta Speedway was Buddy Candler's attempt to bring the future to Georgia. Automobile racing was becoming popular in the North and Midwest, with tracks opening in Indianapolis and elsewhere. Buddy saw no reason why the South shouldn't have its own racing venue, and he had the money to make. He purchased land and hired engineers to design a 2-mile oval track. The construction was elaborate and expensive, with banked curves designed to allow cars to maintain high speeds throughout the circuit. He built grandstands that could accommodate thousands of spectators, along with facilities for mechanics, drivers, and support staff. The Speedway opened with great fanfare. Racing celebrities from across the country descended on Atlanta, bringing with them the glamour and excitement of this new sport. The local newspapers covered every race, every crash, every victory. Buddy himself competed as an amateur driver, satisfying his need for speed and danger while simultaneously promoting his investment. For 2 years, the Atlanta Speedway was the talk of Georgia. Society families attended races as social events, women in their finest dresses and men in their best suits, all gathered to watch these mechanical marvels hurtle around the track at speeds that would have been unimaginable just a decade earlier. But the Speedway had a fatal flaw: it didn't make money. The costs of maintenance and operation were enormous, and while individual races drew good crowds, they weren't enough to offset those costs. Buddy, with characteristic impulsiveness, had built the Speedway without doing thorough market research, without calculating whether there was actually sufficient demand to sustain the business. In 1911, just 2 years after it opened, the Atlanta Speedway closed its gates permanently. Buddy had lost a fortune on the venture, adding to his growing reputation as someone who couldn't finish what he started, who pursued every shiny object that caught his attention without consideration for practical realities. But here's where the story takes an ironic turn. The Speedway property didn't vanish. Buddy converted it into an airstrip, calling it Candler Field. He had developed an interest in aviation, seeing in airplanes the same promise he had once seen in automobiles: the promise of transcending earthly limitations, of moving faster than nature had intended. Candler Field started small, just a grass landing strip used by barnstormers and mail carriers. But it was well located, and as aviation grew more important, the field grew with it. Eventually, it was purchased by the city of Atlanta, which continued to expand it. During World War II, it became a major military airfield. After the war, it continued growing, eventually becoming Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, one of the busiest airports in the world. Buddy Candler had accidentally helped create a global transportation hub. Even his failures, it seemed, succeeded in ways he never intended or understood. The farm that became a fantasy. In 1910, while the Speedway was still operating and before its inevitable failure, Buddy made a purchase that would define the rest of his life. He bought a ramshackle farmhouse on 42 acres of land along Williams Mill Road, just north of his brother Charles's estate, called Callanwold. The property was known as Briercliffe Farm, a name that suggested pastoral simplicity and agricultural productivity. That's exactly what Buddy used it for, at least initially. He threw himself into farming with the same enthusiasm he brought to every new project, raising cows, sheep, pigs, and chickens, selling meat and produce to local retailers. But Buddy being Buddy, he couldn't just farm normally. He had to innovate, had to push boundaries, had to create something spectacular. His dairy operation became famous throughout Georgia for its advanced technology. He installed electric lights in the barns, a rarity in 1910, and electric fans to keep the cows comfortable during Georgia's brutal summers. He even installed individual drinking fountains for each cow, ensuring they always had access to fresh water. Cleanliness of his operation was remarkable. While most dairies of the era were breeding grounds for bacteria, where tuberculosis and other diseases could easily contaminate milk supplies, Buddy's dairy was spotless. Agricultural experts came from across the South to study his methods. During World War I, his farm supplied milk to Fort Gordon, and military inspectors praised the operation's hygiene and efficiency. But farming, no matter how innovative, was never going to be enough for Buddy Candler. As he watched his father's fortune continue to grow, as he saw his siblings, particularly his older brother Charles, building grand homes throughout the Druid Hills neighborhood, a different vision began to crystallize in his mind. He didn't want a farm. He wanted a palace. He wanted a statement. He wanted something that would make people stop and stare, that would prove once and for all that he, Asa Candler Jr., was somebody worth noticing. The inheritance that changed everything. The year 1916 was pivotal for the entire Candler family. Asa Sr., now 65 years old, and at the height of his success, was elected mayor of Atlanta. It was the culmination of a remarkable career, from small-town pharmacist to soft drink magnate to leader of Georgia's most important city. But there was a complication. As mayor, Asa would be responsible for making decisions that could affect the Coca-Cola Company's interests. To avoid any appearance of conflict of interest, he made a momentous decision. He would give his children their inheritances early and transfer control of Coca-Cola to them. The division of wealth was not equal. Charles Howard, the responsible eldest son, received the largest share. The other children received portions commensurate with their contributions to the business and their perceived trustworthiness. Buddy, unsurprisingly, received the smallest portion. Family legend holds that Asa Sr. deducted Buddy's outstanding debts from his total inheritance, debts that may have amounted to as much as $100,000, an enormous sum in 1916. Even diminished, Buddy's share was worth millions, but more importantly, he now had a voice in the company's management, a seat at the table alongside his more responsible siblings. 3 years later, in 1919, the Candler children made a decision that would shock their father and alter Atlanta's business landscape forever. Meeting without Asa Sr.'s knowledge, they voted to sell the Coca-Cola Company to a consortium of investors led by Ernest Woodruff. The price was $25 million, over $400 million in today's dollars. Why did they sell? The reasons varied by individual. Charles Howard wanted to pursue banking and real estate. The sisters wanted financial independence and security, but Buddy's reasons were perhaps the simplest and most honest. He wanted cash, and he wanted it now. He had plans, grand plans, and those plans required capital. Asa Sr. was reportedly devastated by the sale. Coca-Cola had been his life's work, the thing he had built from nothing into an empire. To see his children sell it so casually, to outsiders no less, must have felt like a profound betrayal. But the sale was done, the money distributed, and Buddy Candler, for the first time in his life, had more money than he could reasonably spend. Reasonably, however, had never been a word anyone associated with Buddy. Building the Dream Palace. Construction on the new Briercliffe began in 1920, and from the very first day, it was clear that this would be no ordinary mansion. Buddy hired architect C.E. Fraser, with Dan Bowden assisting, to design a Georgian revival mansion that would be larger than his father's house, larger even than his brother Charles's impressive Callanwold estate. The Georgian revival style was perfect for Buddy's purposes. It evoked the grandeur of colonial America, suggesting old money and established aristocracy. The irony that the Candlers were decidedly new money, having made their fortune within a single generation, was apparently lost on Buddy. He wanted to look like he came from generations of wealth, even if that meant fabricating a history that didn't exist. The construction process was a spectacle in itself. Dozens of workers descended on the property, clearing land, laying foundations, erecting walls. Buddy was on site constantly, making changes, demanding improvements, pushing the architects and builders to create something unprecedented. When the main house was completed in 1922, Atlanta society gasped. The mansion contained over 40 rooms, spread across 3 floors. There were 7 bedrooms, each with its own marble fireplace carved by Italian craftsmen. There were 10 bathrooms, an extravagant number for the era when most homes had only 1 or 2. There were multiple solariums where exotic plants could flourish year-round, bathed in Georgia, sunlight filtered through expensive glass. The library featured hand-carved wood paneling that had taken craftsmen months to complete. Each panel was a work of art, featuring intricate designs that drew the eye and rewarded careful examination. The shelves were built to hold thousands of books, though whether Buddy, with his lifelong difficulty focusing on reading, ever filled them, remains unclear. The third-floor ballroom was perhaps the most spectacular space. It featured 14-foot ceilings covered in gold leaf that caught and reflected light in ways that made the entire room seem to glow. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and the floor was polished hardwood perfectly suited for dancing. This was where Buddy intended to host the parties that would make Briarcliff famous, where Atlanta's elite would gather to celebrate and be seen. But Buddy wasn't satisfied. The house was magnificent, certainly, but it wasn't enough. He wanted more grandeur, more spectacle, more proof of his success and importance. The grounds became his next obsession. He hired landscape architects to create terraced gardens that cascaded down the hillside. Fountains were installed, featuring statuary imported from Europe. Walking paths wound through carefully cultivated flower beds where roses and azaleas bloomed in riotous profusion. Greenhouses were constructed to house orchids and other exotic plants that couldn't survive Georgia winters. He built 2 swimming pools. One was private, reserved for family use, featuring elegant stonework and surrounded by manicured lawns. The other was larger and would eventually be open to the public, complete with a Coca-Cola stand, serving cold drinks to swimmers and sunbathers. The public pool was Buddy's gift to the community, his way of sharing the magnificence of Briarcliff with ordinary Atlantans who could never afford such luxury themselves. Tennis courts were added, their surfaces maintained to professional standards, A golf course was laid out, with a putting green where Buddy could practice his swing. Stables were built to house horses, and kennels were constructed for the hunting dogs that Buddy occasionally remembered to exercise. The carriage house was converted into apartments for servants who were essential to maintaining an estate of this size. A full staff was required: cooks, maids, groundskeepers, chauffeurs, and Buddy employed them all, creating a small village of people whose livelihoods depended on his continued wealth and whims. Construction costs were staggering. Newspapers reported $30,000 for tile work alone, equivalent to nearly $500,000 today just for tiles. The total cost of the main house and initial grounds improvements has been estimated at well over $1 million, an almost incomprehensible sum for a private residence in the 1920s. But Buddy still wasn't finished. 3 years after completing the main house, in 1925, he embarked on his most ambitious addition yet: the Cathedral of Excess. The music room that Buddy built in 1925 was, by any measure, absurd. It rose 3 stories high, with a vaulted Tudor ceiling that drew the eye inexorably upward. The walls were clad in richly carved oak panels, each one a masterpiece of the woodworker's art. A limestone fireplace 9 feet tall dominated one end of the room, large enough that a person could stand inside it. But the room's true purpose, its reason for existing, was to house Buddy's ultimate statement of excess: an Aeolian pipe organ so enormous it rivaled those found in cathedrals. The organ cost $94,000, nearly $1.5 million in today's dollars. It featured 88 ranks and 187 stops, making it the largest privately owned organ in Georgia and one of the largest in the entire South. The pipes ranged from tiny whistles no bigger than a pencil to massive tubes taller than a person. When played at full volume, the organ could shake the windows and rattle the walls, filling Briarcliff with music so powerful it could be heard from neighboring estates. The psychology behind this purchase was transparent. Buddy's father owned an Aeolian organ. His brother Charles owned one too. But Buddy's organ was bigger than both of them, more powerful, more impressive. It was a child's logic. Mine is bigger than yours, executed with multi-million-dollar resources. The room itself, which Buddy called Dovey's Hall, became a venue for concerts that were broadcast on radio station WSB, Atlanta's premier radio station. Musicians would come to play this magnificent instrument, and their performances would be transmitted across Georgia and beyond. For a few hours, Briarcliff would be the cultural center not just of Atlanta, but of the entire region. Buddy learned to play the organ himself, though his performances were more enthusiastic than skilled. He would practice late into the night, filling the mansion with music, sometimes beautiful, sometimes cacophonous, always loud. The servants learned to sleep through the noise, or at least to pretend they did. The music room wasn't just about the organ, though. It was about creating a space so grand, so overwhelming, that visitors would be struck speechless. And in that goal, Buddy succeeded completely. People who entered Dovey's Hall for the first time invariably stopped, their eyes widening, their breath catching. The scale of the room, the richness of the materials, the sheer audacity of building something this elaborate for private use, it was almost too much to process. But Buddy wasn't done transforming Briarcliff into his vision of paradise. The music room was just one element of a larger plan, a plan that would include creatures that most Georgians had only seen in picture books. The menagerie, when elephants walked. Georgia Buddy's private zoo became the stuff of legend long before it closed. The exact circumstances of how he acquired the animals remain murky. Some accounts suggest he purchased them from a struggling European circus he encountered during his travels abroad. Others claim he bought them from various dealers and collectors, assembling his menagerie piece by piece over several years. What's certain is that by the mid-1920s, Briarcliff housed one of the most impressive private collections of exotic animals in America. The four elephants were the stars of the show. Buddy named them Coca-Cola, refreshing and delicious, turning his father's product into living advertisements that children could pet and feed. The elephants lived in specially built enclosures at the back of the property, and on special occasions, Buddy would have them parade through the grounds, their massive forms lumbering past the mansion while guests watched in amazement. There was a Bengal tiger, its orange and black stripes vivid against the Georgia greenery. It paced its enclosure restlessly, a reminder of distant jungles and dangerous hunts. Next to it lived a black leopard, sleek and predatory, its yellow eyes tracking every movement with unnerving intensity. Lions added their roars to the nighttime chorus, their deep calls echoing across the estate and into neighboring properties. Bears, both black bears native to Georgia and larger brown bears from elsewhere, shuffled through their territories. Exotic birds filled aviaries with color and sound. Species from South America, Africa, and Asia, their plumage more vibrant than any native Georgia bird. There was a gorilla, whose presence simultaneously fascinated and terrified visitors. In the 1920s, gorillas were still largely mysterious to the American public, known more from sensationalized accounts than from scientific study. To see one in person, even behind bars, was an experience that left a lasting impression. And then there was the baboon. This particular primate proved to be smarter than anyone anticipated and far more problematic than Buddy had bargained for. Baboons are intelligent, social creatures with a capacity for problem solving that often surprises their keepers. This one apparently had been observing the locks on its enclosure, learning the mechanism, waiting for an opportunity. That opportunity came in 1935. Exactly how the baboon escaped remains unclear. Perhaps a keeper left a latch unsecured, or perhaps the creature finally figured out the lock's trick. Either way, it got free. The baboon made its way off the Briercliffe property, traveling through neighboring estates. It encountered a woman whose name has been lost to history, but whose terror in that moment is easy to imagine. A wild baboon, loose in suburban Atlanta, approaching with who knows what intentions. The baboon bit her, not severely, but enough to draw blood and justify medical attention. And then, in a detail that newspapers couldn't resist reporting with barely concealed glee, the creature stole her purse, tore it open, and devoured $60 in cash. The woman sued Buddy Candler and won $10,000 in damages, roughly $225,000 in today's dollars. It was a humiliating episode for Buddy, made worse by the fact that his neighbors had been complaining about the zoo for years. The noise, they said, was intolerable. Lions roaring, elephants trumpeting, exotic birds shrieking at all hours. The smell was even worse, particularly in summer, when the heat intensified every unpleasant odor. After the baboon incident, the authorities finally had grounds to act. They ordered Buddy to close his private menagerie. He could have fought the order, could have used his wealth and connections to delay or overturn it. But even Buddy could read the room. The zoo had become an embarrassment, and embarrassments were one thing his pride couldn't tolerate. He donated all the animals, along with substantial funds for their care, to Grant Park Zoo, which would later become Zoo Atlanta. The elephants named for soft drinks left Briarcliff forever. The big cats departed. The gorilla, the bears, the exotic birds, all were loaded onto trucks and transported to their new home. Briarcliff suddenly felt emptier, quieter. The wildness that Buddy had imported from distant continents was gone, leaving only the mansion and its grounds, still impressive but somehow diminished, like a circus, after the performers have packed up and moved on. The golden years before the fall. But before the zoo closed, before the murder that would stain the estate's reputation, Briarcliff experienced a period of genuine glory. From roughly 1922 to 1930, it was indeed what the newspapers called it, 40 acres of fairyland. Buddy and Helen threw parties that became legendary throughout Atlanta and beyond. These weren't small, intimate gatherings. They were spectacular events, sometimes hosting hundreds of guests, that transformed Briarcliff into a wonderland of light, music, and celebration. The preparations for these parties would begin days in advance. Additional staff would be hired. The gardens would be manicured to perfection, every leaf and petal positioned just so. The mansion would be cleaned until it sparkled, every surface polished, every chandelier gleaming. The kitchen would begin preparing food, elaborate multi-course meals that showcase the finest ingredients and the most sophisticated culinary techniques available in the South. On the night of a party, Briarcliff would be transformed by light. Lanterns would line the walkways. Candles would flicker in the gardens. Inside, every chandelier would be lit, every lamp burning, making the mansion glow like a beacon visible for miles. Cars would line the long driveway, expensive automobiles carrying Atlanta's elite to Buddy's palace. The guest lists were carefully curated to include everyone who mattered in Atlanta society. Politicians came, seeking campaign donations and favorable coverage in newspapers that Buddy knew how to influence. Business leaders attended, networking and making deals over cocktails and cigars. Artists and writers came, drawn by the promise of patronage and the spectacle of seeing how the other half lived. Society matrons brought their daughters, hoping that exposure to such wealth might lead to advantageous marriages. Helen presided over these events with grace and elegance, her training in the social arts perfectly suited to the role of hostess in a mansion like Briarcliff. She moved through the crowds effortlessly, greeting guests, introducing strangers who might benefit from knowing each other, ensuring that everyone felt welcome and important. Buddy, by contrast, was often the center of attention without trying to be. His energy was infectious, his enthusiasm genuine. He would show guests around the estate, pointing out new additions, explaining the latest improvements. He would take people to see the elephants, watching their reactions with childlike delight. He would lead tours of the music room, often sitting down at the massive organ to play a few thunderous chords that made everyone laugh and cover their ears. These parties often extended late into the night and sometimes into the next morning. Jazz bands would play in the ballroom, their rhythms setting feet to dancing. Champagne would flow freely. This was before Prohibition, or during Prohibition, when such laws were routinely ignored by the wealthy. Food would be served in waves, each course more elaborate than the last. The parallels to F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, published in 1925, are striking and probably not coincidental. Fitzgerald's novel about a mysterious millionaire throwing lavish parties in a desperate attempt to win back his lost love captured something essential about the era. Like Jay Gatsby, Buddy Candler was new money trying to buy respectability. Like Gatsby, he threw open his doors to anyone who would come seeking validation through excess. And like Gatsby, he would discover that wealth alone couldn't protect him from tragedy. Family tradition holds that Buddy's oldest surviving son, John, once remarked that he had lived like the Great Gatsby during his youth at Briercliffe. It's a telling comparison, one that suggests the family itself recognized the parallels between fiction and their lived reality. But where Gatsby's story was invention, the Candler saga was all too real, and its consequences would prove far more lasting. When happiness died on a cold morning. Helen Candler died in January 1927, and with her death, something fundamental shifted in the atmosphere at Briarcliff. She was only 40 years old, taken by an illness that the newspapers described vaguely, as was the custom of the time when discussing the deaths of prominent women. The local papers praised her as a leading figure in local social and civic circles, a woman who had embodied everything Atlanta society valued. Her funeral was a major social event. Bishop Warren Aiken Candler, Buddy's uncle and one of the most prominent Methodist leaders in the South, officiated at the service. Hundreds of mourners attended, filling the church and spilling out onto the surrounding streets. Helen was buried at Westview Cemetery in a plot that Buddy immediately began obsessing over, designing and redesigning the landscaping with the same attention to detail he had once devoted to Briarcliff's gardens. For Buddy, Helen's death was catastrophic. She had been more than a wife. She had been the stabilizing force in his life, the person who could calm his manic energies and channel them in productive directions. She had managed the household, hosted the parties, and maintained the social connections that gave Briarcliff its place in Atlanta's elite circles. Without her, Buddy was unmoored, adrift in his own excess. His drinking, which had always been heavy, became heavier. Friends noticed that he was rarely sober after dinner, that his hands shook in the mornings, that his eyes had taken on a glassy, distant quality. He stopped attending church, much to his family's dismay. He neglected business matters, leaving important decisions to his more responsible siblings. He spent hours alone in the music room, playing the massive organ at all hours, the music growing increasingly chaotic and dissonant. 9 months after Helen's death, Buddy remarried. His new wife was Florence Adeline Stevenson, a widow from Lithonia, Georgia, who had worked as his secretary for 9 years. The speed of the marriage raised eyebrows throughout Atlanta society. A mere 9 months of mourning seemed indecently brief to people who expected at least a year, preferably 2. But Buddy had never cared much about what society expected, and he was desperate for the stability that Helen had provided. Florence was capable and organized, qualities that Buddy desperately needed in a wife. She understood his business affairs, having worked as his secretary. She knew his moods and his weaknesses. If the marriage lacked the romance of his first, it provided something perhaps more valuable: structure. With Florence at his side, Buddy threw himself into new obsessions, and his next obsession would bring both wonder and horror to Briarcliff in equal measure. The magic years. Buddy had always been drawn to magic and illusion, to things that defied rational explanation. As a child, he had been fascinated by magicians who performed at county fairs, watching their tricks with an intensity that worried his parents. They feared he was so entranced he might be led astray by charlatans. As an adult with unlimited resources, he could indulge that fascination completely. He began collecting magical apparatus in the late 1920s, acquiring props and equipment from magicians who were retiring or from estates of performers who had died. His collection grew rapidly, encompassing everything from simple sleight-of-hand props to elaborate stage illusions that required multiple assistants and complex mechanical systems to operate. Card manipulation devices, coin tricks, linking rings. These were just the beginning. Buddy acquired vanishing cabinets, levitation apparatus, sawing in half boxes, and transformation chambers. He purchased items that had been used by famous magicians, pieces that came with provenance and history. He collected books on magic, learning the secrets behind tricks that had amazed audiences for generations. The third-floor ballroom at Briarcliff was gradually transformed into a combination museum and theater. Glass cases displayed rare magical artifacts. Larger pieces were arranged around the room, creating a labyrinth of illusion. A secret door was installed, or possibly already existed, and was repurposed for use in disappearing acts. The gold leaf walls provided a spectacular backdrop for performances. Buddy didn't just collect magic, he studied it obsessively. He practiced techniques, working on sleight of hand until his fingers could execute moves smoothly. He studied misdirection, learning how to control an audience's attention. He read extensively about the psychology of illusion, understanding that magic worked not because the tricks were technically perfect, but because the audience wanted to be fooled, wanted to experience that moment of wonder when the impossible seemed to happen. He began hosting magic parties, events that combined his love of entertaining with his passion for illusion. These soirees became legendary in their own right, different from the grand society balls, but no less spectacular. Guests would be treated to an evening of impossibilities, objects appearing and disappearing, people seemingly defying gravity, transformations that couldn't be explained. Buddy flew magicians into Atlanta on his private airplane, sparing no expense to bring the best performers to Briarcliff. Harry Blackstone, one of the most celebrated magicians of the era, performed multiple times at the estate. Blackstone was known for grand illusions, making women float through the air, producing live doves from empty boxes, making entire automobiles appear on stage. At Briarcliff, he had an appreciative audience and a host who understood and valued his art. Buddy also claimed to have been friends with Harry Houdini, the most famous magician who ever lived. Whether they actually met remains uncertain, but it's plausible. Houdini maintained his headquarters in the Candler Building in New York City, which Buddy helped manage. Even if they never met in person, they would have known of each other, moving in overlapping circles of wealth, entertainment, and illusion. These magic events were intimate compared to the grand parties of earlier years. Buddy would limit attendance to a few dozen people, creating an atmosphere of exclusivity that made invitations even more valuable. Guests would gather in the ballroom, sitting in chairs arranged to face a performance area. The lights would dim, and then for the next several hours, reality would become negotiable. The performances must have been extraordinary. Imagine sitting in a room decorated in gold leaf, surrounded by the wealthy and powerful, watching as a skilled magician made the impossible seem real. The massive pipe organ might provide dramatic musical accompaniment. Champagne would be served between acts, and Buddy himself might perform, his enthusiasm compensating for whatever technical skills he lacked. For a few years in the late 1920s, Briercliffe was a place where wonder lived, where adults could experience the same sense of amazement they had felt as children watching their first magic show. The estate that had been built to impress through scale and luxury now impressed through mystery and impossibility. And then Buddy met Jose Cruz, and everything changed. The magician from Manila. The exact circumstances of how Buddy Candler met Jose Cruz are lost to history, obscured by time, and the scandal that would later overshadow their relationship. What's known is that during a trip to the Philippines, possibly for business, possibly for pleasure, probably both, Buddy encountered a young Filipino magician whose talent and charisma immediately captivated him. Jose Cruz was 24 years old, skilled in the performance arts that had flourished in the Philippines, which had been exposed to magical traditions from both Asia and the West. He was handsome, charming, and possessed the kind of stage presence that made audiences lean forward in their seats. He performed traditional Filipino magic alongside Western-style illusions, creating a hybrid style that was unique and compelling. Buddy saw in Jose not just a talented performer, but a potential protege. Here was someone who could help him expand his collection, who could teach him advanced techniques, who could transform Briarcliff's magic shows from amateur affairs into professional quality performances. And so, in a decision that would have tragic consequences, Buddy invited Jose to return with him to Atlanta. The offer must have seemed incredible to Jose. America was the land of opportunity, and here was a wealthy patron offering him employment, housing, and the chance to work with one of the finest collections of magical apparatus in the country. He accepted immediately. In April 1925, Jose Cruz arrived in San Francisco aboard the SS President Taft, accompanied by his younger brother Philemon and another companion. They traveled across the country by train, arriving in Atlanta to a life that must have seemed like a fantasy. Jose was given an apartment above the garage at Briarcliff, comfortable quarters with a view of the estate's grounds. His duties were varied. He would serve as Buddy's butler when needed, but more importantly, he would be his magic tutor and the primary performer at Briarcliff's illusion shows. For the next several years, Jose became an integral part of life at the estate. He taught Buddy new techniques, patiently explaining the mechanics of tricks and the psychology of misdirection. He helped organize the legendary magic parties, coordinating with visiting performers and ensuring that shows ran smoothly. He maintained the collection of magical apparatus, keeping the delicate mechanisms in working order and occasionally building new pieces when Buddy wanted something custom made. Jose also became somewhat famous in Atlanta's magic community. Local magicians would visit Briarcliff to see the collection, and Jose would demonstrate pieces, explaining their operation and history. He was generous with his knowledge, understanding that magic thrived when magicians shared secrets among themselves, even as they kept those secrets from the public. The Filipino community in Atlanta was small in the 1920s, and Jose must have felt isolated at times, far from home and family. But he had found a place where his talents were valued, where he could practice his art surrounded by the finest equipment available. He had security, comfort, and the patronage of one of Atlanta's wealthiest families. He also had access to Buddy's gun collection, which included an ivory-handled pistol that would later become infamous. The Girl and the Growing Darkness. In the months leading up to January 1931, Jose Cruz began a relationship with a young local woman named Gladys Fricks. The details of how they met, how the relationship developed, and what exactly characterized their time together remain frustratingly vague, filtered through time and the sensationalism that followed their deaths. What we know is that Gladys was a local girl, part of Atlanta's middle class. Not wealthy, but respectable. Her family knew of the relationship and had concerns, though accounts differ on whether those concerns were about Jose's nationality, his position as essentially a servant to the Candlers, or something else entirely. The 1920s and early 1930s were a time of significant racial prejudice, and Filipinos occupied an ambiguous position in the American racial hierarchy. Not white, not black, but something in between that made many white Southerners uncomfortable. But Gladys's friends later testified that she seemed happy with Jose, that she sought out his company willingly, that she showed no signs of being coerced or manipulated. On the night of January 17, 1931, she went out with him of her own accord, apparently expecting a pleasant evening together. What happened in the hours that followed remains the subject of speculation. Did they argue? Did Jose discover something that drove him to desperation? Did Gladys try to end the relationship, perhaps under pressure from her family? Or was this a premeditated act, planned in advance with the murder-suicide note already written? The couple went out that Saturday evening, their last evening together. At some point during the night, they drove to the southern edge of the Briercliffe estate, near the putting green where Buddy practiced his golf swing. It was a secluded spot, far enough from the main house that sounds wouldn't carry, hidden by trees and the landscape's natural contours. There, in the darkness, with the fog rolling in from the surrounding fields, something terrible unfolded. 2 shots were fired, 2 lives ended, and a scandal that would haunt Briarcliff for decades was set in motion. The discovery. James Stark had been working as a groundskeeper at Briarcliff for years. He knew every inch of the property, every tree and pathway, every corner where teenagers might try to trespass or where animals might den. His morning routine was invariable: arrive at dawn, walk the grounds, checking for damage or problems, report anything unusual to the main house. On the morning of January 18, 1931, he followed that routine as always. The fog was particularly thick, muffling sound, and reducing visibility to just a few yards. He walked through the gardens, past the swimming pools, across the lawn toward the putting green. That's when he saw the car. At first, he felt only annoyance. Trespassers were an occasional problem, people who mistook the estate for public property or who deliberately ignored the boundaries. Faculty from nearby Emory College were permitted to walk the grounds, but they didn't usually drive onto the property, and they certainly didn't park by the putting green. As he approached, his annoyance transformed into unease. The car's windows were fogged from the inside, condensation that suggested the vehicle had been there for hours. No one seemed to be moving inside. The fog swirled around the automobile, giving the scene a dreamlike, nightmarish quality. Stark reached the car and looked inside. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Jose Cruz sat in the driver's seat, slumped to one side, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. Blood stained his temple and had run down the side of his face, now dried and dark. In his lap lay Gladys Fricks, her body positioned as if she had been reaching toward him when she died. Her abdomen was stained with blood from a gunshot wound. Stark stumbled backward, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. He turned and ran toward the main house, his heart pounding, his breath coming in gasps. By the time he reached the mansion and alerted the authorities, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the telephone. Police arrived quickly, along with the coroner. They examined the scene with the methodical care of professionals who had seen death before, though perhaps not in such settings. The car was photographed. The bodies were examined in situ before being removed. Evidence was collected. Shell casings, the gun itself, a note. The note was crucial. Written in what appeared to be a woman's handwriting, it suggested that Jose and Gladys had entered into a suicide pact, that their love had been thwarted by circumstances, and that death together was preferable to life apart. It was the kind of romantic tragedy that newspapers loved, the kind of story that would sell papers for weeks. But investigators immediately noticed problems with the suicide narrative. The handwriting might appear feminine, but when compared to known samples of Jose's writing, it matched. He had written the note, possibly trying to disguise his hand, possibly in a state of mental disturbance that affected his penmanship. More troubling was the physical evidence. Only one empty shell casing was found in the car, yet 2 people were dead from gunshot wounds. Where was the second casing? Had it been thrown from the vehicle somehow? Or had there been only one shot, followed by some other method of death? The gun itself was immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with Briarcliff. It was an ivory-handled pistol, distinctive and expensive, part of Buddy Candler's personal collection. Jose had access to the collection, had handled the weapons while helping Buddy maintain them. He had taken the gun without permission, bringing it with him on what would be his final night. A coroner's jury was convened that very afternoon, an indication of how seriously Atlanta authorities took the matter. The death of a white woman under suspicious circumstances, with a Filipino man as the apparent perpetrator, had the potential to spark racial violence if not handled carefully. The jury heard testimony from police, from the coroner, from friends of Gladys who described her relationship with Jose. After reviewing all the evidence, the jury reached a verdict that contradicted the suicide note. Jose Cruz had murdered Gladys Fricks and then killed himself. The note was a fabrication, an attempt to disguise murder as mutual tragedy. Gladys had trusted Jose, had gone with him willingly to a secluded spot on the estate, and he had betrayed that trust in the most final way imaginable. The murder weapon was displayed by the undertaker, a common practice in the era, allowing the public to see the instrument of death. Newspapers ran photographs of the ivory-handled pistol and a pearl-handled dagger that had also been found in the car, though apparently unused. The story made front-page headlines across Atlanta, and suddenly Briarcliff was famous for something other than parties and elephants: the aftermath and the questions. Buddy Candler was not implicated in the deaths. Police questioned him, of course. It was his gun, his employee, his property. But there was no evidence that he knew Jose had taken the pistol. There was no suggestion that he had any involvement in or knowledge of whatever darkness had been growing in Jose's mind. And yet, the scandal tainted everything. Briarcliff had been the site of a murder, the place where a young woman's life had been stolen by a man who lived on the property. The magic shows that had seemed so charming now felt sinister. Had Jose been practicing deception in more ways than one? The exotic atmosphere that had made the estate so fascinating now seemed dangerous and foreign. Questions lingered, the kind of questions that have no answers but that people can't stop asking. Why had Jose killed Gladys? Was it a crime of passion, a moment of rage that spiraled out of control? Or was it premeditated, planned in advance with the note written beforehand? Had there been a specific trigger, a rejection, a threat, a discovery? Or had Jose been descending into madness for months, with no one noticing or caring enough to intervene? What had Gladys's final moments been like? Had she realized what was about to happen, or had it come as a complete surprise? Had she tried to flee, to fight back, to reason with him, or had death come so quickly that she had no time to understand? And what about the note? The jury concluded that Jose had written it, but why had he tried to disguise his handwriting? Was it an attempt to protect his reputation after death, to ensure that he would be remembered as part of a tragic romance rather than as a murderer? Or was there something else, some message hidden in the words that no one understood? The questions were endless and unanswerable. What we know for certain is that 2 young people died on Briarcliff's grounds, that their deaths were violent and tragic, and that the estate would never quite escape the shadow of that January morning. The magic parties stopped. The ballroom fell silent. Buddy, who had been drinking heavily since Helen's death 4 years earlier, seemed to retreat further into himself. The man who had once commanded elephants and conjured illusions was running out of tricks, running out of reasons to maintain the facade of happiness. Briarcliff, the palace built to impress the world, had become a monument to loss: the loss of Helen, the loss of innocence, the loss of the belief that enough money and enough excess could keep darkness at bay. The long decline. The 1930s were not kind to Buddy Candler or to America as a whole. The stock market had crashed in October 1929. Just over a year before the murders at Briarcliff. The Great Depression settled over the country like a suffocating blanket, transforming abundance into scarcity, confidence into desperation. Even families as wealthy as the Candlers felt the effects. The fortune that had seemed inexhaustible suddenly had limits. Investments that had paid reliable dividends now failed. Properties that had appreciated steadily now sat unsold. The Coca-Cola company, now under the control of the Woodruff family, continued to prosper. People might not have money for luxuries, but they could still afford a nickel for a Coke. But the Candler children no longer owned the company, and the money they had received from the sale was slowly being depleted. Buddy's father, Asa Candler Sr., died on March 12, 1929. At the age of 77. He had been unwell for several years, his health declining as he watched the empire he had built pass into other hands. His death was front-page news across Georgia, the passing of one of the South's great industrial pioneers. His funeral was attended by thousands, and tributes poured in from business leaders, politicians, and ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by his philanthropy. For Buddy, his father's death was complicated. They had never been close. Asa Sr. had never understood his second son, had never been able to accept that Buddy was fundamentally different from his siblings. There had been love, certainly, but it had been overshadowed by disappointment and frustration. Now, with his father gone, Buddy felt both liberated and lost. He no longer had to live up to impossible expectations, but he also no longer had the structure that those expectations had provided. The golden age of excess was ending, and Briarcliff's master was faltering badly. Buddy's drinking, which had been heavy for years, became impossible to hide. Friends and family members noticed that he was rarely sober after noon. His hands shook constantly now, a tremor that no amount of alcohol could quite steady. His face had taken on the bloated, reddened appearance characteristic of chronic alcoholism. His eyes were often bloodshot, their focus uncertain. He stopped maintaining the estate with his former obsessiveness. Gardens that had once been immaculate grew somewhat wild. Repairs that would have been made immediately were now delayed. The swimming pools still sparkled, but the landscaping around them became overgrown. The tennis courts developed cracks that weren't filled. The golf course's grass grew uneven. Florence did her best to manage both her husband and the property, but the task overwhelmed her. She wasn't Helen, who had grown up in this world and knew instinctively how to navigate it. Florence was practical and organized, but she lacked the social connections and the natural grace that had made Helen such an effective hostess and estate manager. The parties had stopped after the murders, and they never really resumed. Occasionally, Buddy would host a small gathering, usually for business purposes, but the grand celebrations that had made Briercliffe famous were over. The ballroom gathered dust. The massive organ fell silent, its pipes going unused for months at a time. The secret door that had been used for magic shows remained closed, perhaps sealed shut, perhaps simply forgotten. Death becomes his business. What kept Buddy going during these dark years, strangely enough, was death itself. For more than 20 years, he had been involved in running Westview Cemetery in Atlanta, one of the largest and most prestigious burial grounds in the South. Now, as his own life seemed to be spiraling toward its conclusion, he threw himself into cemetery work with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Westview Cemetery had been founded in 1884, part of the rural cemetery movement that sought to transform burial grounds from crowded, unhealthy churchyards into park-like spaces where the living could visit the dead in pleasant surroundings. The cemetery covered nearly 600 acres with winding roads, landscaped gardens, and elaborate monuments. Buddy oversaw the construction of one of the largest community mausoleums in the world, a massive structure designed to house thousands of remains in above-ground crypts. He planned every detail, the architecture, the materials, the layout of the internal corridors. He insisted on the finest marble, the most skilled stonemasons, the most durable construction techniques. He designed elaborate monuments for families who could afford them, creating miniature palaces in stone that rivaled anything found in European cemeteries. He planned garden pathways with the same attention to detail he had once devoted to Briarcliff's grounds, selecting every tree and shrub, positioning every bench and fountain. And he obsessed over his own mausoleum, the final resting place where he would spend eternity. For years, he refined its design, making changes and improvements, never quite satisfied. He planned the landscaping down to the smallest shrub, selecting plants that would bloom in different seasons, ensuring that his grave would always be surrounded by color. He specified the stone, the inscriptions, the interior decorations. It was as if he was building another Briercliffe, a mansion for the dead, to replace the one for the living that had brought him so much grief. The man who had spent his life chasing novelty and excitement was now preparing meticulously for the one thing that couldn't be rushed or avoided, his final exit from the world he had tried so desperately to conquer. There's poignant irony in Buddy Candler finding purpose in cemetery management. The man who had filled Briarcliff with elephants and exotic birds, who had built swimming pools and ballrooms, now found meaning arranging the final resting places of others. His work at Westview was genuinely impressive. The cemetery became a showcase of memorial art under his guidance. But cemetery work couldn't solve his fundamental problems. Briarcliff continued draining his finances. His drinking damaged his health. The fortune that seemed infinite in 1919 was proving very finite. The sober years. Then, in the late 1930s, Buddy shocked everyone. He stopped drinking. Whether it was a health scare, Florence's ultimatum, or a moment of clarity at rock bottom, Asa Candler Jr. stayed sober for the rest of his life. Sobriety didn't restore his fortune or repair the damage alcohol had caused, but it gave him clarity. He was in his late 50s, his health compromised, his estate an unaffordable burden. The palace built to prove his worth now proved only that pride and excess were poor foundations for lasting happiness. The mansion required constant, expensive maintenance. Property taxes were relentless. By the end of the 1930s, the mathematics were brutal. Buddy couldn't afford to keep Briercliffe. The war years. The 1940s brought war and final reckoning. As conspicuous consumption seemed obscene, Buddy closed entire wings, reduced staff, and watched his estate decay. Swimming pools were drained, tennis courts cracked, gardens grew wild. By 1948, it was untenable. The General Services Administration purchased the property for a veterans' hospital. Buddy received far less than the mansion was worth, a final indignity for a man who had spent a fortune trying to prove his value. He and Florence relocated to the top floor of the Briarcliff Hotel. It was comfortable, but it wasn't the castle on the hill. The final chapter. For 5 years, Buddy lived in that penthouse, his world contracted after decades of 40 rooms. He continued his cemetery work, perfecting his mausoleum design. His liver, damaged by decades of drinking, was failing. Cancer had been diagnosed. On January 11, 1953, Asa Griggs Candler Jr. died at 72. The obituaries were brief and restrained. A family friend said simply that Buddy didn't do anything small, the truest summary of his life. He was buried at Westview in the elaborate mausoleum he had designed. Rebirth and transformation. In 1953, the federal government converted Briarcliff into the Georgian Clinic, Georgia's first alcohol rehabilitation facility. The irony was perfect. The mansion built by an alcoholic was now dedicated to helping others overcome the same addiction. In 1965, Briarcliff underwent its most dramatic transformation. The Georgia Mental Health Institute built a massive modernist tower and surrounding cottages on the grounds, connected by underground tunnels that would fuel decades of dark legends. For 32 years, from 1965 to 1997, the mental hospital operated there. The mansion's elegant rooms were subdivided, drop ceilings installed, linoleum laid over hardwood floors. The music room's pipe organ was removed. Layer by layer, Briarcliff's grandeur was buried beneath institutional necessity. The building absorbed decades of human suffering, thousands of patients experiencing their worst moments within walls that had once hosted parties. When the hospital closed in 1997, it left behind empty buildings and countless untold stories. Hope arrives. In 1998, Emory University purchased the property, but struggled with what to do with a deteriorating mansion. When Netflix chose the hospital tower as the exterior of Hawkins Laboratory in Stranger Things, 2016, it brought international attention, but to the wrong building. Preservationists like Charlie Payne and writer Sarah Butler fought to save the mansion, documenting its history and advocating for restoration. Then in 2022, hope arrived. Emory brokered a ground lease with Gallery Living, which would build a senior living facility and restore the original mansion as an event space and community center. Craftsmen began restoring Briarcliff, repairing the roof, replacing water-damaged plaster, cleaning the carved wood paneling and marble fireplaces. The mansion that had hosted millionaires and mental patients would now serve seniors in their final years. The enduring monument Briercliffe stands today as a monument to ambition and resilience, to the strange ways history transforms our grandest gestures into something we never intended. The building has outlasted its builder's intentions, accumulating meanings through every transformation, from showplace to hospital, from ruin to renewed purpose. Drive through DeKalb County today, and you'll see the towers rising above the trees. Visitors can tour the restored spaces, see the music room and ballroom, walk gardens that echo the original designs. Sometimes staff report strange occurrences, doors opening, phantom music, footsteps in empty halls. This is the legacy of Asa Candler Jr. Not the Speedway or real estate deals, but this mansion, this impossible dream that refused to die. Buddy wanted to matter, to be remembered, to build something significant. And he succeeded, just not in the way he imagined. The mansion stands, the stories persist, the legacy endures through constant transformation. This is how troubled dreams become lasting contributions, how forgotten mansions become legends, how a desperate bid for recognition becomes, against all odds, permanent. Briarcliff endures,